Kathleen, as you will all been communicating with over the past few months, is the Research Associate and Catfish Project Officer. Kathleen joined WMU and the project in August 2019, no, 2021, sorry. And actually, just to sing a little praise for Kathleen, she's been a real engine for the project, and really, I don't think we would be anywhere close to where we are without her. So a big thanks to Kathleen for all the work she's done, running the first two workshops and helping the whole process move forward. And most of all, this beautiful book that you see outside, which is the proceedings of the first workshop and the second workshop. Kathleen had a huge role in the editorial process of that, so a big thanks to that, and a big thanks to KMI for the production of that book. So, okay, so let's move on. A little bit about Kathleen. Kathleen has a PhD from the University of Cape Town. She has also undertaken her LLM degree, which was at the University of Melbourne, is that correct? Half and half, half and half. So she has a strong legal background, and she's worked particularly in the world of fisheries, both on small-scale fisheries, but also on broader global fisheries issues, particularly interested in economic aspects and the role of subsidies, which is what Kathleen's going to talk to us today, because you're probably aware that there has been some pretty significant developments in the past year through the World Trade Organization, and them actually reaching some kind of consensus and conclusion and decision on the future of subsidies in global fisheries. So please, Kathleen, the floor is yours, and we look forward to your presentation.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you to Francis so much for that very kind introduction. So I have to say I didn't expect to be up here again quite so soon, but we're nothing if not flexible and adaptable in Catfish, so here I am. As Francis mentioned, I am a lawyer, I have a legal background, so this presentation will be more legally based, so I hope you've all had your coffee, and I will try not to get into too many technical aspects. So today, as Francis mentioned, I'll be talking about fishery subsidies and their relationship with IUU fishing. So my presentation today will we'll look first of all at, it'll give a kind of a broad overview of fishery subsidies for those of you who aren't too familiar with them. What are they? What is their sort of worldwide scope? And the actions that have been taken at international and regional level to address this problem. And thereafter, I'm going to take a bit of a closer look at the WTO agreement, the new agreement provisions, and specifically their effect on developing country fisheries. So, start at the beginning. What is a fishery subsidy? And this is perhaps a little bit more complicated than you might expect. And to fully understand what a fishery subsidy is, it's important to take a step back and look at what a subsidy is. So there's a lot of different definitions in the literature and also in international organizations of a subsidy. But because fishery subsidies have really been dealt with primarily in trade agreements, it's actually important to look at the World Trade Organization's definition of a subsidy, which comes from its agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. So this is quite a long definition, but there's really four major elements you need to understand when we look at what a subsidy is. The first is that there has to be a financial contribution, which doesn't necessarily have to be a direct payment. It can be a foregone payment, it could be a loan, a tax break, anything of that ilk. And it has to be given by a government or a public body. So it's not something which is given by the private sector unless they're acting on behalf of government and fulfilling government functions. There has to be a benefit conferred, and that essentially just means it has to have a market value. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly for this presentation, a subsidy must be specific. So what that means is it has to be a specific payment to an industry or to a geographical area. So if we look at that definition, we can start to see, if we apply this to the fisheries sector, the types of payments that could be considered fishery subsidies. And so we have the quite obvious ones, which make fishing a bit easier or increase the amount of fishing that can happen. And that's something like boat building and modernization payments, and also fishing inputs, so things like fuel, ice, bait, and so on. But there's quite a few which are perhaps not so obvious as fishery subsidies. Something like vessel decommissioning, not everybody understands that. That is actually a fishery subsidy, but that's when a government will pay to decommission a boat or buy back boats from the fishing industry. We also have something like price support, which is a sort of more economic measure. That's when a government will ensure that fish doesn't dip below a certain price. By making up the difference, they will pledge that, you know, fish will always be a sort of minimum price in order to stabilize prices, because the price of fish can fluctuate quite a lot on an open market. We also have subsidies for fisheries infrastructure, such as ports and processing plants. There's access agreements. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with distant water fishing, of course. It happens a lot in developing country waters. And when we talk about access payments, these are the payments that one government makes to another government in order to be able to fish in that government's waters, in that country's waters. But that kind of government-to-government payment is not actually a fishery subsidy, because it's not a payment to an industry. So where the subsidy actually arises is when one government makes a payment to another government for access, and then it says to its fisheries industry, you can go off and fish in that country's waters and you don't have to give us anything for it. You know, it's a benefit. It's being conferred on that country's fisheries industry. So that's where the subsidy arises. We also have rural development, and this is when the payment is specific to an area. And if that area has a lot of fishing communities or fishing villages, that actually becomes a fishery subsidy. There's fisher assistance, which is a bit different to fishing inputs, because this isn't targeting the practice of fishing, this is actually targeting fishers. And this is something like unemployment insurance or retraining, for example, to move out of the fishing industry into a different industry. Improvements to safety of fishing vessels is also a fishery subsidy. Fisheries management, actually, because it is a benefit to the fishing industry, because it does help to ensure that stocks are sustainable for the future, is also considered a fishery subsidy. And finally, we have research and development. And that's, of course, can span a very broad gamut of projects. So these are sort of the main types of fishery subsidies that we have. And this is just a whole long list. But about 20 years ago, academics did decide to actually class fishery subsidies into different categories based on essentially their effects on sustainability. And those are the good subsidies, the bad subsidies, and the ugly subsidies, or beneficial subsidies, capacity enhancing subsidies, or ambiguous subsidies. And as I said, this classification is really from the point of view of sustainability, so we're not necessarily looking at fisher welfare here or socioeconomic benefits. It's just good, bad, and ugly from the point of view of sustainability. So going off of that definition, we can see the good subsidies are quite a small subset. So they're things like fisheries management, anything that would make fish more sustainable, essentially. And so CS programs, creation of marine protected areas, and so on. There has been some argument that subsidies such as subsidies for disaster relief, where, for example, a government will rebuild the fishing industry after there's been, say, a natural disaster, and safety at sea subsidies are actually good subsidies. But in fact, if we're looking at this from the point of view of sustainability, these subsidies have actually been used in the past to increase capacity in the fishing industry. So they should really be classed either under capacity enhancing or ambiguous subsidies from a sustainability point of view. We also have the bad subsidies, and of that list that I set out, the majority of those subsidies are going to be considered bad or capacity enhancing. And that's things, of course, like boat building, fishing inputs, and so on. I've actually highlighted fuel specifically there because fuel is one of these strange subsidies which often is given in a sort of broader program, so it's not specific necessarily to the fishing industry because the subsidy may be given to other industries as well, like agriculture or trucking or so on and so on. But the thing with fuel subsidies is that they're actually the sort of largest subsidy that's being given today. And so if we don't discipline or ban non-specific fuel subsidies, even though they don't fall under the definition of a subsidy, that could actually be very problematic for the sustainability of world fisheries. And I'll come back to that a bit later. And then finally, we have the ambiguous subsidies. These are ambiguous for various reasons. So we have something like fisher assistance, which, for example, can be used to prevent fishers fishing in an off-season or a closed area by perhaps making a payment to them not to fish during that time. And so the reason that's ambiguous is because it seems like that would be beneficial for sustainability, right? But the reason it's ambiguous is because it keeps fishers in the fishing industry. We also have something like a vessel buyback program, and the reason that's ambiguous is because it depends how it's structured. So if the vessel buyback program has been created to reduce capacity in the fishing industry, to pull boats out of the fishing industry to reduce fishing pressure, then it has to be structured in a very specific way to ensure that this doesn't allow new entrants to go back into the industry. So licenses also need to be bought back and no new licenses issued. And there obviously has to be a moratorium on fishers taking that money from the old boat and using it to buy a new boat. And then finally, under ambiguous subsidies, we have rural fisheries development. And the reason this one is ambiguous is because you tend to have to weigh up the almost socioeconomic benefits versus the sustainability benefits. But in this particular case, I would say that the socioeconomic benefits would in most cases trump the sustainability benefits, the sustainability problems when it comes to rural fisheries development. So we understand now that subsidies are classed into different categories, and some of them are considered bad, some are good, and some are ambiguous. But what is the problem? What is the scope? What is the global scope of fishery subsidies? Why are they such a problem? So as we can see, the latest estimates of fishery subsidies put these at approximately $35 billion annually. So that's, of course, a huge amount, which is going to the fishing industry in the form of these subsidy payments. And unfortunately, $22 billion of that is capacity enhancing or bad subsidies. And the majority, as I said, are spent on fuel costs. So the world's largest subsidizers, we have China by far, but we also have countries like the EU and the USA who give very large subsidies. But it is quite important to remember that those subsidies are not all capacity enhancing, and there are some regions and countries that actually give more beneficial than capacity enhancing subsidies. So that doesn't mean that they aren't giving capacity enhancing subsidies. It just means that they tend to give more beneficial than capacity enhancing. And regions like North America and Oceania give more beneficial than capacity enhancing subsidies, and also the Republic of Korea. However, small scale fishing, always the loser unfortunately, is only receiving 15% of global fishery subsidies and only 6% of fuel subsidies. So this is just to understand what I've just said in a graphical way, because I like graphs and I hope you do too. And I realize this is a bit small, so I'm just going to show you. This is Asia, Europe, China has its own block here, North America, Africa, South Central America and the Caribbean, and Oceania. So as we can see, the Asian region is giving the most and sort of progressively down. And what I really want to highlight from this graph, and if you can't see, the dark gray block is the capacity enhancing subsidies, the light gray block is the beneficial subsidies. So we can see in certain regions, one is outweighing the other. But what I really want to highlight from this graph is that Of course, we see this massive disparity in different regions of the world, and it's kind of along the lines you would expect. The large developed countries and emerging economies are giving a lot more in the way of subsidies, or able to give a lot more in the way of subsidies, than smaller and less developed regions. Oceania at the end there is a little bit of an outlier because, of course, it has Australia and New Zealand, which are developed countries, but in that case, they've just chosen not to give a lot of subsidies. That was just a choice they made. And then we can also see here the difference between the small-scale sector and the large-scale sector. So the large-scale sector, of course, is receiving the majority of subsidies. Small scale is receiving only a little bit, 15 or 16% there. But I think what's really interesting about this is that if we see the breakdown of subsidies, we see that the large-scale sector is, of course, receiving 60% of their subsidies as capacity enhancing, whereas the small-scale sector is actually receiving more beneficial than capacity enhancing subsidies. So it seems as though there's this tendency to promote fisheries management in the small-scale sector, but not to do it in the large-scale sector, which is a bit bizarre. So finally, let's look at why fishery subsidies are so harmful. So firstly, these subsidies lead to overfishing and overcapacity. And the reason for this, of course, is that when we have things like boat building subsidies, for example, we're building a lot more boats than can actually fish a finite resource, which is the fish stocks. And we also are keeping these boats in the fishing industry by continuing to subsidize their costs. And so this is what leads to the overcapacity. There's too many boats out there trying to catch too few fish, and this, of course, leads to overfishing. Related to this, we also have the creation and subsidization of IUU fishing. So there have been instances where countries have actually continued to subsidize vessels that have been caught IUU fishing. But the bigger problem is actually the fishery subsidies create IUU fishing. And this is related to the overcapacity problem, because you have too many boats out there and not enough fish, and therefore there's going to be a lot of competition, and people will try and cut corners in order to, outdo their competitors. And so there's a massive incentive to then flout fisheries regulations. Another problem in this regard is actually that a lot of the boat building subsidies are given in the form of loans, and then fishers are forced to stay in the fishing industry to pay back those loans. So there's a lot of different ways in which fishery subsidies can create IUU fishing. Fishery subsidies, you might be interested to know, also create and subsidize very large distant water fishing fleets. And that's partly related to the access subsidies I talked about, but mostly related to the fuel subsidies. Because, of course, distant water fishing fleets are not only fishing in the waters of other countries, they're also fishing on the high seas. And without these subsidies, most of these distant water fishing fleets would actually be non-viable. They wouldn't be able to make a profit without having the majority of their costs actually subsidized. Subsidies also create unfair competition, as all subsidies do, but fishery subsidies go a little bit further, because not only are they creating unfair market competition, they also create unfair competition in production, because they may make boats more efficient, for example, and those that are subsidized, not subsidized, cannot compete with these highly subsidized fleets. We of course saw that in those graphs that I showed you. So the smaller developing countries, of course, cannot compete with these very heavily subsidized fleets that come from developed and large emerging economies, because they can't sell their fish at the same price because they're not having their costs subsidized. And because of this, markets are also distorted. Subsidies usually distort markets because really the price of fish should be a lot higher than it actually is, because it's becoming more and more of a scarce commodity. But of course, because it's so subsidized, they can sell the fish at a lower price. And finally, subsidies are very difficult to undo. No politician wants to be unpopular, of course, and they don't want to remove these subsidies. And even if they do, there's often a lot of lobbying that happens from the fishing industry to stop them doing this. So fishery subsidies are so harmful. The question then is, what actions have actually been taken at international and regional level to reduce fishery subsidies? So there has been some action, but unfortunately not enough as yet. So the WTO agreement, or the WTO negotiations on fishery subsidies, actually started in 2001, and they've only now concluded sort of half an agreement this year in 2022. So it's been a 21-year gap. And in that time, fish stocks have continued to deplete. There's been a lot of concern over this problem. And so when the SDGs were created, they included a specific SDG, 14.6, on the issue of fishery subsidies, and actually specifically mentioned the World Trade Organization. So what this SDG asked is that by 2020, the World Trade Organization prohibits certain forms of fishery subsidies which contribute to overcapacity and overfishing, eliminate subsidies contributing to IUU fishing, and also include special and differential treatment for developing countries and least developed countries. So the way that the WTO agreement currently stands, they've done maybe 1.5 of these things. Also during this time, WTO members themselves were getting quite frustrated with the process because it was stalling a lot, and there was a lot of argument over what should be included in this agreement. So they decided to include some provisions in their regional trade agreements that they were negotiating at the time. So there were some smaller ones that were negotiated, but there were also 2 very large ones that were negotiated that actually included some bans on fishery subsidies. And that was the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership and the new NAFTA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. And these agreements covered a significant percentage of world trade and included several major fishing nations. So they were quite important at the time. The CPTPP is also open to further ratifications, and there's a couple of really big players who are in the process of acceding to this agreement, so it's set to actually grow a lot bigger, and that actually includes the UK and China. However, these agreements only included bans on subsidies to IUU fishing and overfished stocks, so they were a lot easier to conclude than the WTO negotiations, which were trying to be a lot more comprehensive and of course include special and differential treatment for developing countries, which these agreements don't include. Okay, but now, oh, sorry, didn't change up. But now we have a new WTO fishery subsidies agreement, which was adopted this year in June 2022 at the 12th Ministerial Conference. So this is the first agreement that the WTO has concluded since 2013, so they're very excited about it, and they see this as an indicator that they can actually negotiate multilateral agreements, because there's been a lot of doubt over the last 20 years. However, the negotiations on this agreement are not yet completed, and this agreement actually includes a sunset clause, which says that if they don't adopt comprehensive disciplines 4 years after the entry into force of the agreement, this agreement will actually terminate. So there's still some work to be done on this, and because it's only half an agreement, it's much less than a lot of people were hoping for. But I don't want to knock it completely, because it does actually include quite progressive provisions in some instances, especially compared to previous WTO agreements. Okay, so now for the fun legal part, and I'll try not to be too technical, but I'm going to take a closer look at the agreement provisions. And to do this, I'm going to look at firstly what's excluded from this agreement, because that can also be quite telling, what's included in the agreement, and also the most controversial and interesting part, which is what's still to be negotiated. And what's still to be negotiated is generally those provisions which mostly affect developing countries. So what's been excluded? So they've excluded aquaculture and inland fisheries, and this was done quite early on in the process. This is supposedly because these are really national competencies, but really I think it's because these types of issues are a bit too sensitive. And if they took 20 years to conclude this current agreement, I don't think they would have been able to conclude an agreement with these issues for another 20 years. We also have the issue of access agreements, which for some reason, they've specifically excluded government-to-government payments. As I said, those aren't actually subsidies. So I think this is just for the sake of clarity, but there's no real indication of whether they will actually exclude access subsidies as well. And then finally, they haven't specifically excluded port subsidies, but I imagine they will not be included just because they tend to be seen as general infrastructure and not specific to the fishing industry. So what's included? Well, there's three major bans on fishery subsidies included in this agreement. The first is subsidies contributing to IUU fishing, the second is subsidies regarding overfished stocks, and the third is subsidies for fishing in unregulated high seas areas. So these bans are actually quite interesting because they don't only apply to vessels and operators engaging in IUU fishing. They also apply to fishing related activities. So that's things like processing or transshipment. When we look at the IUU fishing definition, it relies on determinations of IUU fishing by coastal states, flag states, and RFMOs. I'm not sure if you know, but the RFMOs have these IUU vessel lists that they keep. However, it doesn't apply to port states, which is a bit unfortunate because there could have been some nice synergies there with the Port State Measures Agreement. When it comes to bans on subsidies regarding overfished stocks, the designation of overfished stocks is created using determinations by coastal members or a relevant RFMO. And this is supposedly based on best scientific evidence, but there's no indication of what that actually means. However, there is a provision which says that members should use due restraint when they provide subsidies to unassessed stocks, but that's not mandatory, so whether they actually follow that remains to be seen. And then finally, we have the subsidies for fishing in unregulated high seas areas, and this just provides a little bit of extra protection to these high seas areas. So those are the three main provisions. We also have a few others, which I just wanted to highlight, which are quite interesting. There's exemptions for subsidies for disaster relief, but this only applies to natural disasters, so it wouldn't apply to economic and financial disasters, such as that caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, for instance. There's also fairly strong technical assistance provisions, which is quite interesting because in past WTO agreements, the technical assistance for developing countries has been a bit kind of wishy-washy. But in this case, they've actually set up a WTO fisheries funding mechanism, and they've partnered with a number of organizations which actually have expertise in fisheries, and this should really help developing countries to actually implement this agreement effectively. They also have some notification provisions, which are quite extensive. Again, this is a bit of a departure from other WTO agreements because to date, fishery subsidies haven't really been notified to the WTO, so there hasn't been that element of transparency. And finally, they've created a committee on fishery subsidies, which is responsible for ensuring the effective implementation and operation of the agreement. And again, that's quite useful for developing countries because there will be this specific body set up to help them implement this agreement. So now for the controversial part, those subsidies that are still under negotiation. So we know for sure that they're still negotiating on subsidies contributing to overcapacity and overfishing. So the reason why this provision is so controversial is it's very wide-ranging compared to the other bans that they've included. And the reason for this is that, say for example, I want to give a boat building subsidy to this boat. Under the current agreement, I only have to make sure that this boat has not been involved in IUU fishing, that it isn't fishing overfished stocks, and that it's not fishing in an unregulated high seas area. But if this provision is negotiated and included in the agreement, then I can't give this boat building subsidy to any boat in my fleet. None of them. It doesn't matter what they're doing and where they're going. And so this is, of course, much more wide-ranging. And because it's so wide-ranging, there needs to be exemptions, right? And those exemptions specifically relate to developing countries and to small-scale fisheries. There's also potentially going to be a little bit more negotiation on dispute settlements. I don't want to go too much into technical detail on this, but essentially at the moment, the current agreement is really only semi-enforceable, and there needs to be more included to actually make this fully enforceable. So now I'm going to talk about the effects on developing country fisheries of this agreement. So firstly and most importantly is the special and differential treatment provisions that I was talking about. And these have been quite controversial, and the reason for this is that there's a lot of large developing countries and emerging economies which actually have quite well-developed fishing fleets and distant water fishing capabilities, which have asked for large exemptions from these bans because they are developing. And a big part of this is that the WTO actually allows countries to self-declare as developing. So they're not specifically putting countries into categories. Countries can just say, I'm developing country in this particular issue, and therefore I want exemptions. So there's been a number of types of special and differential treatment being considered, and I've taken this from the 2021 draft that they were negotiating on to reach this current agreement. So one of these types of special and differential treatment was longer time periods for implementation for developing countries, with marine capture fishing, which was less than 10% of global volume. In the current agreement, they actually have exemptions for all developing countries they've been given a 2-year grace period to implement their agreement. But it remains to be seen what will happen with this new provision on bans to subsidies leading to overcapacity and overfishing. There's also been requests for further exemptions for developing countries with low marine capture production, as well as LDCs. And this was pushed for quite hard by the African, Caribbean, and Pacific group, as well as the Small and Vulnerable Economies group, which includes a lot of small island developing states. And this, I think, is eminently reasonable. This is really where the special and differential treatment provisions and the exemption provisions should be aimed at. These developing countries that aren't contributing too much to marine capture fishing and aren't giving very large subsidies. We also have technical assistance and capacity building for implementation. And as I mentioned, that's actually been included in the current agreement already, which is great. And then finally, we have the exemptions for small-scale fishing. So the small-scale fishing exemptions, this has been quite an interesting issue in these negotiations. So right at the beginning of the negotiations, there was a lot of proposals put forward asking for exemptions for specifically rural development for fishing communities, as well as fishing inputs for small-scale fishers. But about halfway through the negotiations, these proposals stopped being made. And the reason for this was that no one could agree on how to define small-scale fisheries because they are such a diverse sector, they're completely different all over the world. And they were looking at all these different metrics, such as boat length, such as characteristics of small-scale fishing, and even potentially leaving it up to each country to define small-scale fishing based on based on their national definition. But they couldn't agree on any of this, and so they just stopped proposing exemptions for small-scale fishing. So of course, small-scale fishing was again being ignored. So in 2021, however, they actually included a new exemption. It reappeared in the draft. And this was an exemption for low-income, resource-poor, and livelihood fishing, or fishing-related activities in the territorial sea of developing countries. So don't get me wrong, I'm very happy this is back in the agreement in some form and it's under negotiation, but this is a very narrow exemption which does tend to ignore the realities of many engaging in small-scale fishing, which may go beyond the 12 nautical mile limit. And also the characteristics included there, they're not defined anywhere, so there's no real indication of what this actually means. What's important to understand, however, is that because small-scale fishers are not getting huge amounts of fishery subsidies, this agreement will still benefit them because by reducing overall fishery subsidies or subsidies to the large-scale sector, that unfair competition that we talked about earlier will be reduced somewhat. So that's still important to remember. However, what's not always so well known about small-scale fishing is that the majority of it is actually inland fishing. And so this agreement won't actually affect those fishers in any way. Finally, we have the issue of access subsidies. Like I said, there's no real indication of whether these will actually be excluded or not in the final draft when it's actually finally negotiated. But we do have kind of a bit of a different situations all over the world when it comes to access agreements and distant water fishing fleets. So as we know, in many places, distant water fishing fleets cause a lot of problems, not just to the sustainability of fish stocks, but also from a socioeconomic point of view. So they can cause conflict with local fishers, negative effects on coastal communities, and so on. But in some cases, in some areas, these agreements actually contribute a huge amount to GDP. In the Pacific Islands, for example, some of these small island developing states, these access agreements contribute more than half of their GDP. And they tend to, in that area in the Pacific, not that they're perfect or anything, but they do tend to contribute a bit more to management. And the stocks there tend to be a bit better managed than, say, in West Africa. So there is this difference between distant water fishing fleets in different parts of the world. And so I think it's in some ways a bit of a false dichotomy to say that these subsidies should either be completely excluded or completely included. And in fact, I think it's a bit of a missed opportunity for improved control of these access agreements because they're completely unregulated for the most part at the moment. And so these access subsidies could potentially be made contingent on various conditions. And that could be improving the transparency of these agreements, which are very opaque at the moment. Improving fairness, and when I say fairness, I mean fairness in the amount of money which is actually being paid for these fish stocks, because at the moment, it's really a fraction of what they're worth. There could also be more robust management provisions and perhaps even development provisions for those coastal communities and small-scale fishers that are being badly affected by these distant water fleets. Great, so that is the end of my presentation. Just to conclude, I just wanted to set out a few key takeaways. So firstly, fishery subsidies are responsible for a lot of the overfishing occurring today, and that includes IUU fishing. The majority of these fishery subsidies are capacity enhancing or bad subsidies, and they're often focused on fishing inputs such as fuel. And several large regional trade agreements and also, of course, the WTO have adopted provisions to discipline these subsidies, but these tend not to cover some of the most contentious issues at the moment. And the negotiations that are still happening are often on issues which are very relevant to developing countries. And I'm happy to take any questions anyone might have. And if anyone is interested in any of the citations included in the presentation, or if for some unknown reason they want to go and read the new fishery subsidies agreement or the CPTPP, I've included all the links and references in the presentation for you.
Great, thank you very much, Kathleen. I now actually understand what's been going on at the WTO because it was so pretty complex to get into the detail, and but that was a very clear summary. I'm sure there will be some questions from the audience. We can start down the front with Dihya.
Thank you. I have a question for you. I would like to have your perspective, your personal perspective on this idea that capacity enhancing is systematically bad, especially after you mentioned the word bizarre for the artisanal sector. I'd love to have your own perspective on that.
Sure. So capacity enhancement in the fleet, I think that in some cases the sustainability of fish stocks has to kind of be a bit secondary to socioeconomic concerns, and I think that needs to be weighed up. And I think that's why I don't think necessarily that all capacity enhancing subsidies are bad, in the sense that sometimes they can have other benefits outside of the sustainability point of view. So that good, bad, and ugly classification is really, like I said, looking at it from a point of view of sustainability. And my personal view is that you need to weigh up different considerations when we look at what is inherently bad when it comes to fisheries subsidies. It's not necessarily always sustainability going to trump other considerations. So I hope that answers your question.
I'll just go up to Brice and then back to Ife. Thank you very much.
Good morning, and congratulations, and thank you for touching upon the crucial matter, because money, finance is at the center of all our issues, the things which go better and the things which go worse. And I think this is one of the virtues of CAPFISH, to clarify some of the misunderstanding. As far as I'm concerned, and I love the movie, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, it's very difficult for me to see safety at sea with a question mark. And I would really try to insist on the fact that CAPFISH should really clarify this matter. I don't see any instance, honestly, in which increasing safety at sea is bad for fishing, because again, as we try to indicate, is to make the system fairer. And because some fishers and ship owners are investing in safety, and I don't think it's bad. They just have to be able to fish fairly. And subsidies, I think the term is difficult. I think that you are right. We should really try maybe to create a new word. I think there should be subsidies, because they are always perceived by the public as being bad. And I think it's going to be very difficult to change that. I think we should create a new category like financial support to more sustainable, safe, and cleaner fishing. Because we should not forget as well that the world of at sea is trying to be cleaner, and it has to. It's a question of fuel, cleaner fuel, and also other means of propulsion. And Pacific is great because they go back to sailing, even in the fishing sector. So I think that this is really the purpose of this project, CAPFISH, to really bring a better understanding, and maybe to be innovative as you are, and your presentation is very good, to propose new understanding and to stop the misuse of some terms which have always a bad connotation, like subsidies. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Yeah, on the safety at sea issue, the reason that they've been, I wouldn't class them as bad necessarily. I would tend to class them as ambiguous, just because, again, I think it's how the program is structured. And that's because there have been instances where people have used the sort of idea of safety at sea to make boats perhaps more efficient and larger. And so it's almost like the reason that it's more ambiguous is because it depends how it's structured. Like, people can use this in underhanded ways. But I agree with you that safety at sea shouldn't be classed as bad, because of course it's such an important issue. And again, like I said to Tahir, I think that it's a matter of weighing up what is more important in certain instances. In this case, fisher welfare in most cases, I think, would trump any potential sustainability problems. It's just that, again, it depends on how the program is structured. Yeah, and with regard to your second part, the issue of renaming subsidies, because there is a negative connotation, I think that when it comes to something like good subsidies or fisheries management, no one really sees that as a bad thing, but people don't really understand that it's a fishery subsidy. And I'm not sure that people are really using those terms synonymously in the literature. But yeah, I mean, with things like cleaner fuel, for example, again, that's an example of sort of weighing up issues. So one of the other issues I tend to use is fishing gear, because of course you can make that a lot more sustainable. And in some cases you do need to make it more sustainable. So you prevent people using very small mesh sizes or dynamite fishing or poison fishing because they can't afford more efficient gear. And so again, I think that, you know, we're looking when we look at this classification, it's very much based on a sustainability point of view. I really think I agree that we need to move towards a more nuanced view of what subsidies actually are, and weigh up all these different potential benefits of these subsidies, and actually create a more nuanced agreement. And so it's actually something which I looked into quite in depth in my PhD on this issue, especially around the issue of small scale fishing, because that's a very nuanced issue when it comes to fisheries subsidies. And my view is actually that you need to have, you know, specific exemptions with specific safeguards to actually really get a proper picture of the issue of subsidies to the small scale sector, and within that be able to weigh up socioeconomic versus sustainability considerations. So I hope that answers your question.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. My name is Ifisnacho Kafeyaud, and I will be presenting later. So my question relates to the artisanal sector or small-scale sector. And from your presentation, it was clear that they get insignificant support. Therefore, do you think they should even be in the discussion when we're talking about subsidies, especially at least when it comes to different countries, when it's clear they barely get nothing? Is it therefore fair when it comes to the discussion around subsidies and harmful subsidies that we should actually be talking about taking away the little they get, or bringing them to that discussion to the level that we have seen in terms of the discussion at the WTO? Thank you.
Thanks, Ife. So I think there are maybe two issues here. The first is that while the small scale sector is mostly not contributing to overfishing, there have been some instances in some countries where subsidies have been given to the small scale sector, and they've actually become almost like a small commercial fleet in a way. And so we can't totally ignore that element. When it comes to small scale fisheries, it's obviously a very diverse sector, and we are all the way from the sort of subsistence end of the spectrum to the small commercial end of the spectrum. And we need to take that into account, I think, when we're thinking about giving, say, boat building subsidies. I think the reason why it's quite important to bring small-scale fishers into this international discourse on fishery subsidies is because these agreements are set to, if they manage to negotiate on these additional issues, quite wide-reaching bans on fishery subsidies. And those could affect small-scale fishing. And yes, they don't receive a lot, but yes, in some countries, they do have these sort of small fishing input subsidies that they get, and we don't want to take that away from them. And also we have, of course, the fact that rural development subsidies for fishing communities could potentially fall under some of these definitions. And for that instance in particular, I think we definitely need to make sure that there is an exemption from any sort of ban that they put in place. Because it's just crazy to me that you wouldn't be able to develop a fishing community and give them, proper healthcare and running water and electricity and telecommunications, because there's this very small potential knock-on effect on sustainability. So I think that's why in this particular instance, it is quite important to have this discussion and bring them into this agreement. Yeah. Sure.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. It was really nice, and I completely support what was said before by Francis. Good to see this agreement in a clear view. Thank you very much. I just want to make a small clarification on something on the question by Brice, because I think it's very, very important point what they highlighted. I mean, the movie beyond the movie, I mean, the good, the bad, and the ugly, the way it has been classified, and the way the subsidies have been classified according to this classification, it has been made by natural scientists. So it has been made, and I think Kathleen mentioned it, but probably didn't emphasize enough on that. It has been made by people which only concern nearly is to make sure that the stock is going to be preserved. And anything which is not to support basically the fish, it's more or less considered bad or ambiguous, including, and this is where it's very sad, including safety, including fishers' welfare. I think it's very much a problem of representation of what is fishing and what is fisheries and who is fishing, who is not fishing. And this association which caused a lot of problem that we discussed already yesterday, this association that the fishing vessel and the fisher on board are basically the enemies. And because of that, this classification was made. And this classification, because it was made only to serve one purpose, when you see fisheries management is super good, when you see research development super good, and fishers are bad, it's really annoying. And I completely concur what you were saying, Brice. And we have to think about that the problem for very long term, now it's changing and it's moving, and we can see that in publication from FAO and some other organization, even with scientists now. There is more concerns now for also the importance to consider the human beings, the people which are working, which are exploited on these vessels, which are living in harsh conditions. And it's a very important element to think always about the representation that we have from the fishers and stop associating them with the fishing vessel owners, which are ultimately the one benefiting from the subsidies. And here in this respect, it's extremely important at one point to consider another type or other types of categorization of subsidies, and probably something which is more related to fisheries management, capital subsidies, and labor support. That would be probably a better way to classify things and to avoid this kind of misunderstanding, which is also continuously promoting that preservation of the resource is good, supporting people is bad. Because we've seen yesterday, we discussed a lot about yesterday, about the detrimental consequences of fishing and IUU fishing on people, on fishers themselves, on their lives, on the exploitation. And there is still here in this classification, this lack of consideration for their humanity. And we have to move this. And this is, and I completely concur what was saying Brice, this is also the role of CAPFISH, to come with this kind of differentiation. Okay, this is what has been done. Probably we have to question it also, because we are bringing this diversity. And yesterday, I think was very interesting with what Dr. Ben-Haid was saying. It's important to consider the humanity behind fishing, and not only the resource, not only the capital, and not only the trade itself. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Raphael. No, I absolutely agree with you. As I said, I think that this issue is a very nuanced issue, and it's something which needs to be considered from a holistic point of view. And yeah, I think that the FAO, for example, you know, when I was writing about the ecosystem approach to fisheries and how this is actually one of the best ways of you know, dealing with fisheries, the FAO actually created this ecosystem approach where they considered the human element. And I think that's so important, because if you look at the ecosystem of fisheries, it includes people, right? They rely on it for livelihoods and food security. You can't just ignore these people who are part of this ecosystem. And so I think it's very important to see this, like you said, very holistically. And yeah, we hope that CAPFISH is actually doing that, breaking those silos and bringing these issues together.
Yeah, hi, Brent, again from Milo. First, I think Raphael actually kind of already touched upon what one of the things I was going to say or ask about. But you know, we had this discussion about like IUU fishing and even this joint working group, and it was IUU fishing and related matters. And you had on there you said the definition being used for this was the normal definition for IUU fishing, which doesn't include labor conditions. So this question that he mentioned also comes to mind, and it made me think of a problem that we've seen, and it's still a problem, and which kind of is almost a cautionary tale. And we see, for example, this problem where people, you know, we want people to go to sea to fish, right? This is can be a great job. It really can be a good job, but there's a lot of things that are making it a difficult job and a hard job, and making it less and less attractive for people to go to sea. One of the things is the accommodation on board the vessels, right? So you go on board a fishing vessel and you're cramped into a small space often. And why is that often? It's because you have to, if you're regulating, fisheries management is regulating, you know, capacity by, let's say, the length of the vessel or gross tonnage, it tends to lead to making as much of the vessel as possible there for catching or storing the fish, and squishing down into a very small space where people can live. So we have this problem in that in order to achieve fisheries management using the metrics that are used to control it, we actually end up damaging or hurting the conditions on board, which means you can't get people to go to sea, and then it undermines the whole way of life. So this kind of consideration would be good if, I don't know how, if this lens is there. I mean, certainly the lens of, you know, there's all this consideration of small scale fishing, which is right, and artisanal fishing, which is right. But I mean, this maybe needs to be looked at from that perspective as well. So it's kind of the same thing as Raphael. Second thing is a question. I'm involved in something, this Maritime Just Transition Task Force in shipping, right? And, you know, it's all about reducing greenhouse gases. And one of the big issues is how you reduce, you know, how you go from using old fuels to new fuels, right? And there's, of course, equipment change, and there's also training of people and all these things, right? So when I see this, I wonder, how does that fit into it? I don't know the contribution of fishing to greenhouse gases, but there's talk about a lot of financial help to transition vessels, at least ships, from polluting vessels or, with substantial greenhouse gas emissions to vessels that don't produce so much emission. And I'm wondering if that falls into the category of subsidies, and if that, because I can see these things clashing with each other. Thanks.
Yeah, so that would actually fall under the category of fishery subsidies. But yeah, to answer your question, during these negotiations, there's been proposed by a lot of people, and that's why I said there's been some debate around safety at sea issues and disaster relief and things like that, about including a sort of green box, which would be subsidies which are good and are exempted. And under that was proposed safety at sea, fisheries management, of course. I can't remember if it was also things like cleaner fuel, but that would certainly fall under there. But there's been quite a lot of pushback against that green box, actually a lot of it from the United States, saying that, there's no such thing as a good fishery subsidy and we can't have this green box because, these could potentially be abused and that sort of thing. And again, but I tend to agree that, again, you can have that green box and you can have certain safeguards, for example. So if you're worried about people abusing those subsidies, you can put conditions there. And that would be a way to provide a more nuanced approach. Because at the moment, when you just outright ban subsidies, and right now there's no exemption for safety at sea subsidies, which I was very surprised about in the latest agreement, and I'm really hoping they will put that in. But yeah, there's no exemption for that at the moment, which is very strange. And of course, it's one of the most pressing issues in fishing. We have so many fishes lost at sea every year. So I'm kind of really hoping that in the future, if they negotiate further provisions, they will actually include an exemption for subsidies for safety at sea, potentially with some exemptions, and also for things like fuel. Yeah, like I said, it needs to be more nuanced than it currently is.
Okay, thank you very much.